Has the Pentagon hidden the real number of civilians killed in the fight against Daesh? A scathing report by the New York Times makes the claim. I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmakers are the innocent people killed by U.S. coalition forces. The U.S. military says its airstrikes against Daesh are the most precise in history. In fact, we're about to speak to a top official who made that claim on this very program just a few weeks back. But we have some tough questions for him. While the Pentagon talks about how it uses 3D models to pinpoint Daesh militants, an investigation found 1 in 5 coalition airstrikes in 2014 killed Iraqi civilians. That's 31 times higher than the US government will admit. So why the massive discrepancy? If the figures are correct, is this a case of the world's most powerful military getting lost in the fog of war? Or is the US intentionally hiding the real damage in a fight with no end in sight? That debate in a moment. But first, here's Vanessa Keneally.
An uncomfortable truth revealed by the New York Times that the Pentagon is killing more civilians than it's telling the public. Over a period of 18 months, journalists found that bombs dropped from the air were a lot less precise than the US-led coalition claims. Part of the investigation saw reporters visiting 150 sites in northern Iraq between April 2016 and June of this year, after Daesh was evicted. Since 2014, the coalition has conducted more than 27,500 airstrikes in Syria and Iraq. But while pilots may have been good about hitting their targets in the field, back in the Pentagon things were more fluid. It claims the ratio of civilians killed in Iraq was 1 for every 157 airstrikes, while the New York Times report, called The Uncounted, said it's more like 1 death for every 5 airstrikes. That's 31 times higher. But the newspaper is not the first to criticise the military's tactics.
It is nevertheless vital that the Iraqi security forces and their coalition partners review how their procedures comply with their obligations under the international humanitarian law principle of precaution and consider all tactical options available with a view to avoiding civilian loss of life.
As well as pinpointing the discrepancies in the Pentagon's calculations, the New York Times report also highlights why, after years of war after war, things haven't gotten better. The Uncounted found a consistent failure by the American-led coalition to investigate claims carefully and keep proper records. And while the report acknowledges that some deaths happened because people were too close to Daesh targets, it also found that a lot of flawed or outdated intelligence was used during missions. Of course, it's not the first time the US military has been in this position. Wars in Vietnam and Iraq, as well as an ongoing mission in Afghanistan, have found deep flaws in death toll records, despite promises that continue to be made.
So I want to draw your attention as you look at this strike. You're going to see that inside this compound are multiple structures, and we destroy only 2 of them while leaving a 3rd standing, which we did to avoid collateral damage.
Earlier in November, the UN said at least 10 civilians were killed in a separate air attack in Kunduz, contradicting a US investigation that said no one was harmed. And while reports like these may expose the fluidity of figures being released by the Pentagon to the American public, it also shows something even more worrying. Nothing is changing. And as the New York Times report concludes, both the pace of attacks and civilian casualties in Syria and Iraq are rising even further, with no definite exit strategy in sight. Vanessa Keneally, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Baghdad by Colonel Ryan Dillon. He's the spokesman for the US-led coalition against Daesh. We're also joined by the former advisor to northern Iraq's Kurdish regional government, Peter Galbraith. He's also a former US ambassador and is currently in Bagan, Myanmar. And with me here in the studio is Ahmed Rushdie. He's a senior foreign policy advisor to the Speaker of the Iraqi Parliament. Gentlemen, I thank you all for joining us on the Newsmakers. Peter Galbraith, let me begin with you. We've been told this is a very precise air war against a really terrible enemy. But this New York Times report, The Uncounted, calls this into question now. Yes, undoubtedly, Daesh is a terrible enemy. But is the coalition understating civilian casualties, or is it maybe even downright lying?
Well, what is clear, and I've been in a number of these conflict situations, including in Afghanistan, is that the U.S. Air Force has the ability to deliver weapons very precisely to where it wants to go. The problem is the intelligence about what's there isn't as good as the precision of the delivery. And so you have in Iraq and in Afghanistan, you have people who are settling grudges, who may give false information, or as the New York Times said, a lot of the information's out of date. So the technology has really far exceeded the human capability. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't say that that the coalition is lying. I think there's a certain amount of self-deception here. And I find it very disturbing that according to the New York Times, that the coalition has then removed the videos that they had uploaded of these strikes, which does suggest that they have something to hide and that they're not being transparent.
Okay, so let's ask Colonel Ryan Dillon. This report says 1 in 5 coalition strikes on ISIS targets kills a civilian. That's 31 times higher than the number you give. Has this report unmasked something that you've been trying to hide?
Absolutely not. So the first thing I would say is that the coalition has proven time and again how open and transparent we have been throughout this entire campaign. And a proof to that open transparency has been the amount of access that we provided to the reporters for this particular report. So we had provided Azmat more than a year's worth of back and forth of information. We invited her to the Command Operations Center to see for herself the process and the deliberate and very considerable efforts that we do to avoid civilian casualties at every cost. So what I would say is to say that we are lying or hiding is so far from the truth that it's hard for me to take that.
Okay.
What else we would say is that we're the ones who provide every single day our strikes, and we also provide the allegations that we are doing on these civilian casualty allegations. So
right, certainly. No, and that's great.
I would argue the other way to say that this is the most transparent.
Okay, that's great, and the transparency is welcome, and that's wonderful that journalists had that transparency. Yet you're not happy with their conclusions. Tell me why you're not happy with their conclusions. You were transparent. You said, okay, here we are. We'll allow you access. They did their research. They went through a very methodical search, and they came up with numbers that were far larger than yours. Tell me why you're not happy with their numbers.
I didn't say that that we weren't happy with their report. They very much carry a lot of the efforts that we go through in our process. But what I would also say is that talking about the different layers of information that are provided, and they're not strictly one source or one way, which is human intelligence. There are layers of different intelligence that go into any time prior to conducting a strike, whether that's from a very precise artillery piece or from one of our aircraft that are delivering munitions.
No, it's important that you say this.
So that process, again, is the most...
Fair enough, and I'm glad you said this, and I apologize for interrupting. I'm going to bring in Ahmed Rushdie in a moment, but it's interesting that you say, you didn't say you're unhappy with the report, so then do you accept the findings that the numbers they've come out with, 31 times higher than the Pentagon's numbers, might be accurate, that these numbers might be worse, more innocent people might have died in the fight against Daesh than has been released by the DOD? Do you accept that?
We do not, and we don't accept that because we don't know exactly how they extrapolated their numbers, and it was a very fine amount of numbers compared to all of the allegations and all of the strikes that we go through our process. We don't think it'll ever meet in as far as air wars or some of the other the other organizations that also continue to find these allegations and send them our way. But we will continue through with our process. I don't know anybody else who is conducting campaigns throughout the world who is as transparent, as open, and provide as much details as we do about our strikes. We hold ourselves to a very high standard, and that is okay, and that's exactly how we should do it. We self-report because it's the right thing to do.
And yeah, and I'm glad you're on the show, and I'm glad you are as transparent as you say you are. Ahmed Rushdie, how do you feel about this? Yes, Daesh is terrible. They occupied large parts of Iraq. They needed American help. They needed American help from the air. But have they killed far too many of your own people during that fight?
ISIS always working with the civilians. That means it's supposed to be there is a high tech to make a differentiation between ISIS and the civilians. That's what the coalition said to us. The problem is that the statistics by the Iraqi authorities saying that liberation of Mosul caused us about 13,000 casualties. 8,000 from them are civilians, while ISIS only 800. So when you are talking about airstrikes and you are talking about liberation of Mosul and you have so much casualties, it will show you why after that everyone makes deals with ISIS, not to make a close, well, let's say, surrounding them by close circle, just put some sort of highway for them to get rid of them. In a way that at the end, the casualties of Mosul is a lesson had been learned by everyone. Now, if we're going to talk about whom we must blame, it is a very important question.
So who do you blame?
Definitely the coalition. There is no way about it. If we are talking about investigations done by the New York Times, okay, let's go to the neutral investigation. Let's do it by the UN. In a way or another, we have casualties. So we must compensate the families first. And secondly, which is a very important issue, how to manage the damage, the psychological damage for the families, because at the end, we are all seeing sleeping cells of ISIS telling to the people that airstrikes killed your family.
The Pentagon doesn't pay compensation money. It would open up a Pandora's box for them. They would be mired in litigation. They pay condolence money, as they call it. It's $2,500 to families of victims. How do you feel about that, Ahmed?
Well, at the end, there is still, just as I said, there are sleeping cell of ISIS. They're going to make, let's say, profit of that. It's that saying the Americans killed you, we didn't kill you. We didn't kill you. Well, at the end, that means the ideology will still there. Well, the incentive will be still there, is fighting the West in a way or another because they killed our families.
Just for me to ask it more sharply, when you're blaming the coalition, are they to blame because they're believing faulty intelligence, or are they to blame for other reasons? What is at the heart of it? Why are they hitting the wrong people, or are they hitting too many innocent people while they're hitting bad people?
Because they told us that they have the technology to make a differentiation between civilians and ISIS, and they talk about it, saying that something like that.
Hold on for just a second. Colonel Dillon, I want you to listen to this. This is what you said to this show just last month about the accuracy of your strikes. Have a little listen.
The coalition has the most precise campaign in the history of warfare. Our missiles and our bombs can make it into a very tight space, into a windowsill. But I can't say the same about Russian barrel bombs that are probably about as accurate as a city block.
Colonel Dillon, are you less certain now or less confident now about your technology, or about the use of your technology, given that this is scandalous? Again, I'll mention it again because it blows my mind every time I read it. The numbers that have come out in the New York Times report say that the civilian casualties, innocent people who have died, are 31 times higher than you say. Are you less certain of that now?
Absolutely not. We're just as certain as I was in my statements before. We are that accurate. We are that precise. And I say this to bring up another point, is that our Iraqi security force personnel, are their lives any less important than anyone else that is on the battlefield? And I bring that up because if you have ISIS, and this has happened so many times in the Battle of Mosul, when you have a vehicle-borne IED, this car bomb that is filled with explosives that is driving its way towards the front lines of Iraqi troops, and we hit that particular car bomb and it explodes and it causes civilian casualties, who takes responsibility of that? The coalition takes responsibility of that. Even though we hit our target, we hit that threat, and we prevented that from killing Iraqi security force members' lives. So I will stand by our statement before to say that, yes, we are that good and we are that accurate. Are there going to be civilian casualties? Yes. And have there been? Yes. But have we done everything that we can to avoid those? And do we learn from those particular instances? We do. And we go back and we try to refine and improve our process every single time. And that is one thing that is absolutely certain from across the board, from those that are looking at the intelligence, that are receiving the intelligence, all the way up through the long chain before that approval is made on delivering ammunition.
Peter Galbraith, that's a sturdy defense. Are you convinced by it?
Well, I think some of what Colonel Dillon says has merit. I think that the U.S. airstrikes are more transparent than any other country's airstrikes. The U.S. does take efforts to try to avoid civilian casualties. But I think we also need to look a little further. The stories in the New York Times were not about U.S. airstrikes on vehicle borne on car bombs. They were on houses, and they were on homes that were simply misidentified due to faulty intelligence. And some of it was pretty sloppy. In other words, there was a place that had been used by ISIS in one of the stories that hadn't been used for a very long time. A mortar was one place, and it had long since been removed. There was not really due diligence to make sure that there was a family living in a house, or the family was living in a house, and because the drone overhead came in the middle of the day when people were naturally inside, and also when women really couldn't go outside. So there was a lot of fault in that was identified in the New York Times, and I really myself would like to pose a question to Colonel Dillon, which is why has the coalition taken these videos offline? I mean, it really looks like if what the New York Times is reporting is that there's something to hide there, and okay. I found that part of it disturbing. If you believe in transparency.
Okay, so let me add to that, Colonel Dillon. And again, I appreciate you coming on the show. We have the story of Bassem Razzo. His family killed in the middle of the night. The coalition had said that this was a home for weapons, a weapons manufacturing house for Daesh or ISIS. This guy happened to speak English, knew someone from Yale Law School, got in touch with the investigators, with the reporters, and so on. Hundreds of emails later, a lot of advocacy later, he had to prove that he was not ISIS and that his family were in fact innocent civilians. And eventually, the videos were quietly taken down by the coalition, and his family members were added to the list of civilian casualties. But initially, the video showed the aircraft hitting this place that was supposedly ISIS. That was the evidence shown by the Pentagon. No more, no less. This guy had to move heaven and earth in order to prove he was not ISIS and his innocent family members were not ISIS. If that's just one story, Colonel Dillon, what about the thousands of other people? Do you see what this means if that's just one little microcosm?
Yes, and I understand, and that's in that story, and in particular, that is we went through and we conducted an investigation on that, and we went back to Mr. Bassem after the fact. The thing is that, as I stated before, we are constantly improving and we're constantly learning from any types of faults that there could be in our process. As an example, as we stated before, it is not just one form of intelligence that is used whenever we conduct a strike. In Mosul, there was a 5-to-1 ratio from platforms to identify the area prior to conducting strikes, and in Raqqa it was 10-to-1. So we are going to continue to go through that very detailed process, and at the same time, we have also in the past, even after a munition has been released, we have waved it off or aborted that when we have seen something come into frame that we don't know of. So these are again, the processes and the steps that we have taken to avoid as many civilian casualties as we possibly can. And the last thing that I would just bring up as well is fundamentally different from the time when the U.S. was here in 2003 to 2008. We are working by, with, and through our Iraqi security force partners.
And Ahmed
so
Rushdie,
there's not a strike, there's not that we conduct without having any kind of say by the sovereign country.
Might that be part of the problem, Ahmed Rushdie? Are some Iraqis giving the coalition bad intel here?
Yeah,
take out my enemies.
Yeah, it can be happen. Definitely, it can be happen. But it needs at the end the certainty of the Air Force, of the American Air Force, of the coalition, is that their responsibility to take that house and to bomb that house in a way or another. It's not the Iraqi responsibility, because if you are believing on Iraqi intelligence and you have casualties, so many casualties, it's supposed to be stop right there and start to reassist all your airstrikes. It's supposed to be like that.
Right. Peter Galbraith, Congressman Ted Lieu read the New York Times or the New York Magazine report and the New York Times follow-up. He's a former Air Force officer. He published a letter asking Secretary of Defense James Mattis to respond to and take corrective actions on underreported civilian casualties resulting from the anti-ISIS airstrikes. Is this the right thing to do? I mean, will there be change? Will there be policy change down the road, do you think?
Well, there clearly should be change. I'm skeptical whether there will be change. Partly because you can just read that story and you see how entrenched the coalition is, the military is, in believing their processes are correct. And the case of Bassem, who what he went through to get the thing corrected was really quite extraordinary. And I want to, one of the other issues there is the compensation. Sometimes each of these strikes is a $1 million, a multi-million-dollar expenditure once you figured in the cost of the munitions, the pilot time, and all of that. And yet the compensation is so paltry. And so it does seem to me that it might, if we're going to be launching $1 million missiles at people and getting it wrong, it might be worth to have more compensation than $2,500 or the $15,000 that was offered to Bassem, who calculated his material loss at about $500,000. So I think there needs to be a balance there. And I do hope that Colonel Dillon will address the question of why the videos were removed.
Okay, so very finally. Okay, so let's, fair enough. Sorry to interrupt you. Very finally, because we're running out of time. Colonel Dillon, why are you removing the videos? It doesn't look so transparent anymore.
Well, first off, as far as the videos, clearly we have, stopped showing many of the different types of strike videos. Just because there's not a necessity to continue to show strike videos. There's other ways, and the way that this campaign and the direction that it is moving away from the kinetic type of fight and the kinetic type of major combat operations.
Or is it because it's embarrassing you?
The 26th of November, just 2 days. I'm sorry?
Or is it because the videos have now embarrassed you because you were so confident that these were precision strikes, and now they're not? No, and we've already talked about the precision of the strikes, and those remain. The strikes in the campaign as we transition, the 26th of November was the first time there were no strikes in Iraq or Syria in the 3+ years that we've conducted this campaign. Okay. Our strikes have supported, and as with many of the other different types of enablers, we provide the Iraqi security forces and the Syrian Democratic Forces to rid this world of the scourge that ISIS is. Right. We have to move on, but I appreciate you taking the time. Colonel Ryan Dillon, Peter Galbraith, and Ahmed Rushdie, I thank you all so much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Still ahead on the Newsmakers, Colombia is seeing its biggest cocaine boom in almost 20 years. Could this be an unintended consequence for peace deal with FARC rebels? And Russia fires back at the US after its journalists in Washington are forced to register as foreign agents. Colombia's President Juan Manuel Santos struck a peace deal with the FARC rebel group. He hoped it would end decades of fighting and paralyze the drug trade. But today, the cocaine business is booming. Even $300 million from the UN to help fight production hasn't been able to rein it in. Earlier this month, Colombian police seized 12 tons of the narcotic, the largest single seizure in the country's history. Could the cocaine boom be a side effect of peace? Sandra Gutman takes a look.
Over the years, Colombia has tried to shed its image as the home of drug cartels and legendary kingpins, but the country has not been able to kick the habit.
Ningún país ha sacrificado tanto en materia de vidas humanas, de esfuerzo. Llevamos luchando contra este flagelo décadas. Es una guerra mundial que el mundo no ha ganado.
Coca production to make cocaine is spiking again. Last year, the number of coca farms doubled, according to the UN. And last week, Colombian forces seized 12 tons of cocaine, the country's biggest ever drug bust. In 1999, Plan Colombia was launched, a $10 billion US-sponsored war on drugs. Coca fields were sprayed, and cocaine labs were destroyed. The Colombian army also fought the FARC, a leftist guerrilla group that controlled the drug routes. By 2012, cocaine production in Colombia reached its lowest point in history. Since then, Colombia's government, under President Manuel Santos, has signed a peace deal with the FARC. Under the terms, the leftist guerrillas have abandoned drug production areas. But in that time, new trafficking gangs have moved in.
Before, there was only one small armed group that used to live here. Now, because of the FARC peace deal, there are several others.
Colombian officials say they've tried everything to stop the coca trade, including offering cash incentives to coca farmers to grow other crops like coffee or coca beans instead. But the program's development has been slow, and now the United Nations is pledging $300 million to help. Another problem is that farmers who've never grown coca have started to, in order to qualify for the cash incentives being handed to coca farmers. The government is also sending eradication teams to destroy coca fields, but those efforts have turned violent. Last month, a standoff between troops and armed farmers resulted in several people dead and dozens wounded.
Yesterday's tragic events reinforce our need to give coca farmers in affected regions all the tools to escape the terrible choice between extreme poverty and illegality.
But while many experts prefer incentives over punishment, the government is now sending tens of thousands of soldiers to fight armed gangs. But with that decision, Colombia may find itself reviving a drug war that many agree never worked in the first place. Sandra Gutman, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Bogota is Bernardo Salazar. He is a law professor at the Catholic University of Colombia. Also in Bogota is Richard McCall. He's a journalist and writer specializing in conflict resolution. Bernardo, let me begin with you. Who is to blame for this new cocaine boom in Colombia?
Well, I think that we have a criminal organization called Los Urabeños, Las Autodefensas, Gaitanistas de Colombia. They have several, they go by several names, and they are responsible for this particular coca cargo, which was confiscated by Colombian police.
Richard, there's a theory that the space was created by the peace deal for all sorts of other actors to move in. So while the FARC moved out with their weapons, all these other groups moved in, and it was business as usual, or even business that's more lucrative than the past. Is that true?
Well, to some extent it is true. Thank you for having me on the show. To some extent, but the cocaine industry is so very complex, and there are various factors which affect the increase in Colombia's production, the price of gold, the suspension of fumigations, of course, that's part of the peace deal, the stronger dollar. You've got words spreading about government subsidies to help replace coca productions for small farmers. The complexities are across the country and are incredibly political and need to be addressed.
Okay, so Bernardo, those who say that the current cocaine boom and the violence that we're seeing now is a side effect of the government's peace deal with the FARC, are they wrong, are they partly right, or are they right?
Well, it's very difficult to isolate a phenomenon like international drug dealing from what happens in a country like Colombia. But I think that the interest that the media has in the issue is related to Donald Trump's threat that if Colombia does not eradicate all of its illicit crops, he will decertify Colombia once again. And I think that this is just posturing by Mr. Trump to gain support for his wall in Mexico. But there's no substantive evidence that that wall will make any difference. And I think that the 13.4-ton cargo of cocaine that was confiscated here in Colombia last week dwarfs the 10 tons that during 2016 the Customs and Border Agency of the United States confiscated during the whole year. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, Colombia has been confiscating about 350 tons of cocaine every year since for the past 4 or 5 years. And that still represents only a third of the potential of what is being produced. But the United States is no longer our major export market. Europe and Australia and even Southeastern Asia are much more interesting. So I think that the reason why this has become news is because Mr. Trump is trying to gain support for his wall, basically.
Yeah, interesting that you mentioned the demand in Europe and Southeast Asia for cocaine. Richard, the United Nations is trying to work with Bogota to get to the root of the problem. They believe they can help solve it by incentivizing farmers to grow other crops, to wean themselves off this crop. They're throwing some money at it to the tune of more than $300 million. Is it going to be enough? Is this a way to solve the problem, Richard?
Well, it will go some way to resolving parts of the problem, but what you have is that a government inexplicably, when it stopped fumigating in October 2015, didn't move into these areas and didn't really push the idea of substitute and alternative crops. Why didn't the government move in? We don't know. Why were they slow to act? Does the government have the commitment to these accords and to the total eradication across the country? There is scarce government presence in Colombia in vast areas of the country. How can farmers get their alternative crops out to market? This is the basic problem that occurs in much of rural Colombia. The peace plan includes thousands of the FARC ex-combatants helping in the eradication of coca. But do we know, and does it deserve the support? Because does the government really believe that this is going to happen?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Bernardo, is the government of Juan Manuel Santos not committed enough to solving the root causes?
Well, I think that international drug traffic responds to other things besides internal domestic policy. What we had is with the oil crisis, Colombia lost, the peso lost value in the face of the dollar, so the business became very attractive once again. In past years, the coca crop area had reduced basically because of the fact that many of the people who were doing that went to illegal gold mining when the gold price was very high. So in the end, this is something that has to do with the global markets and the exchange rate between Colombia's peso and the dollar. And I think that as long as that happens, any policy that the government tries to implement in order to reduce the coca crop will not be very successful unless you have an alternative, which is very difficult, that will be as attractive economically as these illicit goods.
Yeah, Richard, we have an international audience, people all over the world watching here in the English language. So they're seeing we're doing the segment on a cocaine boom in Colombia and narco wars, and I guess they'll be forgiven for thinking, hold on, narcos, that happened in the 80s and maybe in the early 90s. That's on Netflix. That's in the past. That shouldn't be happening right now. To answer the question that some might have, is Colombia slipping back into the darkness of the old days where they're fighting narco cartels? Is it?
I would say that it's not slipping back. Colombia's progress has been constant. What we have is not a repetition of what you see on Narcos, on the Netflix series. What we have is an evolution, an economic evolution in this trade. The huge amount of cocaine that was seized by the Colombian government, by the authorities last week up in northwestern Colombia, that allegedly comes from 10 different groups who were contracting the Urabeños, the criminal gang in charge of the transshipment. So we're not looking at narcos, we're not looking at extravagant cartels like the Escobar cartel, like the Cali cartel anymore. These are different groups working independently to sell their product and get it out via the Urabeños to the international market. And of course, something that hasn't been mentioned is, of course, the chaos, the political, economic, and social chaos taking place at the moment in Venezuela, making it a very easy market, a very easy country to get the cocaine out and into the international market.
Good point. Final question for Bernardo. Can the Urabeños be defeated? Can they be easily defeated?
No, basically not. Because I think that this is a business where they have a learning curve, and they're very good at their learning curve. So you have groups in Colombia, but they're allied with Mexican cartels and with Italian cartels. And as Richard mentioned, Venezuela is becoming one of the main routes to the European market, which is a much more interesting route and market for cocaine at present. So I think that they have a great capacity to adapt to changing circumstances, to changing consumer patterns, and usually state policy is always lags behind their creativity, their fitness to deal with changing markets and changing penal controls, persecution by the U.S. Department of Justice and Colombia's justice is one of the factors that they keep within their business model. So I think that they are adapting quite well, and they will keep expanding as they have since we have this prohibitionist international legal framework to control drugs, illicit drugs.
Right. Okay. And it's going to be another debate, I guess, if I brought up whether we should legalize drugs. But gentlemen, I'm going to put a button on it for now. It's been good having the conversation. Bernardo Salazar and Richard McCall, thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers.
Every move in regard of the Russian media will get a tit-for-tat response. And who it falls on, this should be easy for Washington to work out. The clock is ticking.
The U.S. is making some Russian news organizations register as foreign agents. That's angered Vladimir Putin, so he shot back by passing a similar law through the parliament in Moscow. Foreign media now has to brand their Russian language news as the work of foreign agents. They'll also have to disclose their sources of funding. The back and forth is part of the fallout from allegations that the Kremlin interfered in last year's US presidential election. Joining me now from Moscow is former Russian diplomat Vyacheslav Matusov. And in Brussels, we have Morgan Bjerregaard. He's the president of the European Federation of Journalists. Gentlemen, I thank you very much for joining us. Vyacheslav Matusov, let me begin with you. Is this the right move from the Kremlin to get foreign media to register as foreign agents?
Of course, it's on my private opinion, it is natural course. Why? Because now Russia and the Western countries, first of all the United States, are in the situation of big confrontation. Confrontation in Syria, in Far East, in Middle East, in Ukraine, in Europe, in Baltic states. So the informational field is a sphere of confrontation too. That's why I consider that any measures against each of two sides are absolutely normal. And if the United States demanded from Russia today to register in the US as a foreign agent, that is absolutely clear and understandable. And from Russian side, when they demanded to acknowledge all American registered agencies or information media, I think it's also a good response, because if you're working in the country that you are in confrontation, you should await some kind of measures to be undertaken to prevent from informational interference.
Okay.
America blamed Russia for electoral interference. Russia now close to presidential elections too. And I think it is not a very bad thing. It makes our relations with the United States more clear, okay, more honest, and more understandable.
So, okay, that's a really cynical view of the media. Morgan Bjerregaard, is that what's happening? The Russians use the media that they fund instrumentally against the West, and Western media outlets, particularly American media outlets, as Mr. Matusov mentioned, are using their influence instrumentally against the Russians, and this is a state of confrontation. Let's just be honest about it. That's how he sees it. How do you see it?
It's a totally attack against freedom, press freedom to do this. And I'm looking at Russia just now. Regarding Russia, to just now with the election upcoming election, it's more important than ever that you've got free and independent media covering what happens in Russia, as it is in all other countries in the world. It is the absolutely wrong direction, trying to labeling media just because they're coming from other countries to be foreign agents. That's not the way of free media to operate. It should be possible for any journalist, for any media, to be able to ask any questions, and all politicians and governments should stay away from newsrooms. Right. This is one of the key roles of a free and independent press. Also, what Russia itself is supporting during the through Council of Europe, through their as participating states of OSCE, through United Nations, it is in the total wrong direction. And it is dangerous for press freedom, and it's dangerous for democracy when such things happens.
Okay, dangerous for democracy. So, Mr. Matusov, let's set aside the American worries about RT or Sputnik. They don't like the channels. They believe the channels are there for interference. They don't like the editorial output. America's going through its own moment, right? There's, some would say paranoia, some would say it's valid. Whatever that may be, there's a tit for tat here. Let us look at some of the media organizations that have been named as having received letters from the Russian government that they will be listed. Radio Free Europe, Free Liberty, CNN, Voice of America, Deutsche Welle, the Germans. Can you honestly tell me that they have been hostile towards Russia and Russian interests? Do you have any evidence that they've been hostile towards you?
I don't think that it is something against all mentioned media. Why? Because it is not prohibited to freely work in Russian Federation. and free collecting any information they need, but only they should register themselves to place themselves in Russian media sphere as a foreign agent.
But they're
foreign
saying,
agent
sir,
that not...
sorry to interrupt you, sir, and I apologize for interrupting you. They're saying, hey, we're media, we're free media. Yes, we get our funding from a particular country, but we're not the embassy.
No other way.
They're saying we're not the embassy, we're not the information wing of the embassy, we're not representing a country. That's their point, whereas Russia is treating them as a country.
Nobody blame it for that they represent government in spite of the fact that some informational agencies really represent. For example, Freedom radio station that belong to Congress of the United States. So we put aside who is behind the media. The main is it is American media is freely working in Russian Federation under cover of democracy, right of people and so on. We know George Soros, how he worked in Russia 25 years. He established quite a lot of network of his supporters in education, in many spheres of Russian life, social and economical even life. So I think that restrictions of that kind, that you can work, but you should remember, you are foreigner in my country. I think it is a normal thing. It is not prohibited to work, but it is prohibited to work undercover. You can collect any information. You make any meetings, any contributions to your media, but you should register. You appears on Russian public that you are foreign. Not, is there nothing against?
Let me ask Morgan Spiragat. Morgan Spiragat, the suggestion from Mr. Matusov is that there are organizations who are using press freedom and freedom of speech as a Trojan horse to undermine Russian society. Do you believe or accept that there might be some truth or any truth to that?
I don't see that that free media, that organizations are undermining the society. The best way to develop a society, the best way to be sure that you've got free media is actually to let it be free, and to have the pluralism that we need. And this is something which it's also guaranteed by having more media, by having media from several countries, covering what happens without being labeled as foreign agents or something else. That you have this pluralistic approach to what happens in a country. I think this is one of the best guarantees that you get a view on and the best view on what happens in the political life, what happens with the democracy, what happens during a general election. Every time a government or a parliamentarian start to make restrictions one way or another on media, it is a step towards censorship. It's a step to have more to less freedom, and it will always damage our democracy when that happens.
Right.
So stay away from that.
Okay.
Be free, be open. I think this is one of the and that would be fantastic if Russia says that instead of trying to go in the opposite direction.
Okay, Vyacheslav Matusov, as a former ambassador, as a political man, as a man who knows how the game is played, if tomorrow the US Justice Department says, guess what? We changed our mind. We're taking RT and we're taking Sputnik and whoever else off the Foreign Agents Registration Act. They don't need to register. Forget about it. They can operate freely in America. Then do you think it would be okay for Russia to stop the requirement of all the other foreign media from registering and then everybody's square and equal again?
Well, I don't think that I am not against register RT as a foreign agent, because it's really governmental supported channel in working on American soil. Why should I be against its registering as a foreign agent? Of course it's foreign. What is the program? What is blamed upon this RT activity in the United States? The blame is that they reflect official point of view. What do you need? They should explain non-official against Russian government. No. It is paid by Russian government, Russian budget, and so it reflects its official policy, politics. I think it is absolutely normal. And if anyone doesn't want to hear explanation of Russian real reasons in very hot issues in the international affairs, I can't understand why they don't hear our arguments, official arguments. Not dissident arguments, not oppositional point of view. What I can say that during 25 years, America acquainted to some kind of oppositional voices, that they were expressing Russian will, Russian opinion. But now I think it is showed that opposition forces inside Russia is not so strong as was desired by the United States. So that's why they are disappointed with Russia Today, RT, that they are explaining Russian official position.
Right.
To our TV
Understood.
listeners and watchers.
Okay, gentlemen, I've got to move on, but I appreciate your candor from both of you. It's an interesting topic to cover. I thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers, Vyacheslav Matusov and Morgan's Bjerregaard. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, a pro-Russian rebel province in eastern Ukraine installs a new leader. Could it threaten an international peace process? Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.